Welcome to this lesson, which is going to talk about some of the aspects of life that soldiers, Minutemen, and mercenaries faced in the time of the American Revolution, and we'll do that by looking at some of the aspects that influenced the colonial army and also to sort of compare it with a longer standing military body that the British had access to. The Continental Army was the name of the forces that rallied to fight against the British Army in the American Revolution. This army was established by the Continental Congress on June 14th of 1775, and they named George Washington as commander-in-chief. The initial fighting forces in the American Revolution were in the Boston area, and they broke out as a result of the Battle of Lexington and the Battle of Concord that happened in 1775. The forces in the Continental Army were representatives from the 13 colonies that would later become the United States of America. So why is this important to understand what life was like for soldiers? It's critical to learn about the lives of soldiers and the men who volunteered to fight for freedom and independence in the 13 colonies, because it demonstrates the values and belief systems they held dear, as well as the strategies of war they used to win. And it's also interesting to see how they overcame some of the challenges associated with fighting a war. They had many obstacles in their path, as you'll learn throughout this lesson, and also in comparison to the British military, they were seemingly unmatched when you take a look at the Minutemen and the soldiers fighting for independence, and yet they were able to succeed. So let's look at some of the challenges that they went through. The Continental Army was officially established from a Continental Congress resolution in 1775. The purpose of this resolution was to coordinate all of the military efforts that were going on in the 13 colonies. Rather than having them be operating separately, the goal was to unite them together in an official rebellion against British oppression. The soldiers who were part of the Continental Army, typically they didn't have formal military experience, they didn't have uniforms. There were also no existing structures that determined hierarchy, commanders, regiments, any of the aspects that you would see in a typical organized military of today, or even an established military like the British had at this time. And as a final challenge, there were also limited supplies and firearms with which to equip them to fight this war. And you have to imagine that so many of these people who did take up arms were aware of all of the disadvantages that they faced entering the conflict, but this only serves to show how important it was for them to fight anyways, even when they knew they were so unmatched on various levels. In comparison, it's easy to see how the British soldiers had many advantages over the newly formed American Continental Army. The British had a well-established and regimented standing army, an established navy, a greater supply of clothing, powder, guns, training, discipline operation. All of this made it easier for the British to coordinate their efforts. And in addition, the British were also well supported by German mercenaries who provided additional troops to fight the war in the colonies. The American militia had no uniform whatsoever, although the Continental Army did establish brown as its official color. But this was also a challenge because at the time there was a shortage of brown cloth, so some regiments made do with what they have at the time, and that was usually blue or gray. Most militia members simply took what they were able to bring, which was often a hunting shirt and whatever weapons they might have had present at their homestead. When soldiers signed up for enlistment in the American Revolution, they were promised to receive payment at the end of their service. This bounty was paid out in land or money. In addition, they also received a monthly salary based on their rank. They did have to purchase their own gear, weapons, and uniforms, and people from all walks of life were joining the Continental Army. Some slaves even offered up their lives to fight in exchange for freedom. While soldiers came from all different age categories and walks of life, the majority of them were between the ages of 18 and 24. So in addition to all these disadvantages they faced, one of the other primary challenges of living in this time was fighting off disease. During this time, more soldiers were killed from disease than from actual combat. Most soldiers suffered from poor diet and malnutrition, damp shelters that contributed towards sickness, worn out clothes, and unsanitary conditions. All of these factors increase their chances of becoming sick, and the medical care in hospitals available during this time period wasn't extremely high quality. So a lot of soldiers became sick and passed away as a result of disease. And since it was sort of an all hands on deck effort with people fighting, they just didn't have the supplies to keep the soldiers healthy, to make sure that they were eating enough nutrition, keeping them out of the cold. Remember, many of them were just wearing hunting shirts or whatever they could pull together as a uniform. But the Continental Army also did not have the resources to have a system of medical care and medical response in place to help deal with that. And so this combination of being prone to disease and not having supplies was deadly for many of the soldiers. In conclusion, life was not easy for soldiers during the American Revolution, especially since a lack of supplies limited the rations they did have of weapons, clothes, and food that were all so necessary to fighting this war. And just this is such an interesting lesson to talk about because it helps to illustrate just how incredible it is that so many of them showed up and kept fighting despite these disadvantages, and especially that they were ultimately able to achieve success.